We are going to start with Scott, who called in a couple of weeks ago and wants to talk about the problem of evil. Welcome back to the show, Scott. How have you been?
Hey, I've been great. How are you guys doing?
Doing good. Excited to talk to you again. How can we help today?
Well, I wanted to sort of do evil part 2, if that's is that an appropriate title? I don't know.
Evil part 2 sounds like every horror film that's come out of Hollywood in the last 10 years. So good according to me. Let's go.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, what I did last time was identify myself for you and Eric, and John. Do I call you John? Do I call you Godless Engineer? Do I call you GE? What do I call you?
It doesn't matter. Anything works for me. Any of those works great.
Okay, I'll call you John since that's what V's calling you.
Okay.
A couple weeks ago when we were talking, we had talked about evil, and Eric had indicated that he sees evil as an action, a verb, and not a noun, not any other kind of form of grammatic, expression. So, and we didn't really get to explore that a whole lot. We went into some other areas, and I wanted to sort of pick it up there.
Sure. Well, neither of us are Eric, but I could do my best to maybe answer from my perspective, and I'm sure John will do the same.
No, and I understand that, and that's what I wanted to ask was, do either of you or both of you believe people themselves can be evil?
What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I hesitate to use the word evil because that, I don't know. I guess just for me, it has a lot of like religious context around it, like evil. Like I would think that there are certain things that we could probably brand as evil if we were to define evil as something so beyond the pale it's just unthinkable that it would be done. I think that you could, if you defined it that way, you could definitely label things as evil. I don't think that people can inherently be evil. I think that they can either become evil like through their actions and just the way they view life. I don't know. Maybe I'm not answering the question appropriately, but I don't think that people are inherently evil, but their actions and maybe they can become evil at some point just by, I guess, being the worst human being on earth. So I don't know if that answered it appropriately.
Yeah, John, I get what you're saying. I think that I agree with you. I think a really good place to start is to say I don't think anybody is born evil. I don't think that evil is an inherent property. I think that evil for myself is an adjective. We describe things as evil if they evoke certain emotions and cause certain kinds of harm. That is a good word to use in certain contexts. Now, I think before we can go any further, though, we would need to agree on a definition of evil because, and I know this is our line, define the term, right? But if we are saying evil means possessed by Satan, then no, we're going to disagree on that. But if evil just means, hey, this person is doing harmful things and seems to get some weird kind of perverse delight out of harming other people, I would say that if that's the definition of evil we're going with, then certain people who have consistently done these things could be described as evil. But again, that's the result of actions as opposed to an inherent property. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense, and I understand what you're saying. As far as definitions go, obviously, full disclosure, I'm a historic Orthodox Christian. I mean, I'm down the line as far as what I believe, as far as that goes. So that's no surprise. So it'll be no surprise, for you to hear that I believe that people and evil is such a loaded word, but that humankind is inherently, oh gosh, there's not a word that'll ever sound good because it's not supposed to, but that people are inherently inclined to do the wrong thing. I think that's the best way to say it without making people sound like they're all, Adolf Hitlers.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that depends on what rules we've set up, right? So like if we lived in a society that defined eating sugary food as wrong, then I would agree with you that people are inherently inclined to do the quote unquote wrong thing because of the way our biology is set up. We crave that kind of food for a very specific reason, which is way, way back when we could guarantee that if a food tasted sweet, it would be able to give us certain kinds of energy and certain kinds of sustenance. So sure, I think again, we're running into that definitions problem, which is, okay, what does doing the wrong thing mean? And maybe, just maybe, if most people who are otherwise decent humans are consistently doing the wrong thing based on a worldview, that worldview might need to look at some stuff too, right?
Yeah, I agree with the. Well, I was going to say I agree with V on this, but also, I mean, I feel like what your statement kind of implies here, your question implies, is some kind of absolute standard for what is right or wrong. To say that people are born wanting to do the wrong thing, when you try to apply that to like infants, I mean, how can an infant like know that it's wrong to do something? I mean, we generally impart information on infants. We tell them that this is wrong, and as they start to learn, they start to formulate their own moral foundation. As they go through life, and so I feel like what V said. You have to define what you mean by wrong or right. I still don't think that you can say that people are inherently drawn to do the wrong thing. I think that maybe, given any one particular like foundation that you're working off of, you could easily see everybody as wanting to do the wrong thing because they're not following your foundation. And that would, from your point of view, be seen as the wrong thing being done all the time because it's not the way you would do it.
Yeah, I guess a good question for you, Scott, is what would the right thing be? If all humans are inherently predisposed to doing wrong things, what are some right things that we're not doing inherently well?
Here's where I would go with that. Setting aside the Bible, setting aside the Quran, setting aside all the religious standards for right and wrong that have been passed down through thousands of years. Setting those aside, let's just go with modern culture and what we universally, sort of uniformly recognize as the wrong thing, the right thing. We have cultural examples. For instance, we have movies that explore this, like The Purge, for instance. Not one of my favorite movies artistically, but it raises an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
If we set aside all consequences, all law enforcement, all punishment, and people were just let loose to do whatever they were inclined to do, what would society look like for the 12 hours or the 24 hours of that time
right.
period?
So,
what would happen?
Well, hold on. Let me. I'm somewhat of a movie buff, and I've seen every single Purge movie because I do, in fact, like that series. And I feel like you saying that and characterizing it that way really doesn't understand what happened in that universe that is created by it. Maybe this is a bit pedantic for my part, but if anybody has watched the first Purge movie, they actually had to push people into doing those things. And it's even explored in the main line of movies that it's not actually people doing bad things. It's actually bad people who are at the top of the government wanting to exterminate the lower class people. So this isn't like some commentary on the inherent evil nature of humans. It was actually a commentary on how the upper class, I guess, is trying to eradicate, quite literally, the lower class of people. And that's what those movies really kind of embody there. It's not actually about inherent evil in people. In fact, in the movies, when they do this as a test run in, I believe it was like New Jersey or something, that nobody killed each other. Like there was maybe one crazy person that went through and like killed people, but for the most part, everybody else was just like having a good time. So, I mean, using that movie, I don't think really proves your point.
Also, I do want to make a distinction here between being law-abiding and being a moral person, right? Because we're assuming that the laws are inherently moral or leading us towards a more moral society. And for a lot of history, including right now, that is not the case. So there are bad, evil laws that law-abiding people uphold and could be considered evil, right? Like I know Nazi Germany is an overextended metaphor at this point, but it was illegal to do the right thing in that context. So I kind of see where you're going with this, but in addition to maybe just not quite grasping the basis of what the movie's saying, I also do want to make sure that we're not doing this thing where we're saying that law equals morality, because it's very, very different and sometimes directly in conflict with each other.
Okay, bad example. Let's go with something real life. And I wasn't using the movie as the example, just as an example of what would happen in our actual society if
fair. Well, in this case, I think real life examples are probably a little bit better, just because narrative interpretation doesn't get in the way as much.
Okay, bad example. Sorry. Real life example. One of my favorite movies, if not my very favorite movie for a number of different reasons, and not because it's a feel-good movie, is Schindler's List. And we're all familiar with the Holocaust. We're all familiar with holding Hitler and what his regime did up as sort of the prototype of evil. I don't know anybody in their right mind and who's conscientious and who's a right-thinking person who disagrees with that. But there are elements within the Holocaust that I think are intriguing, and that is how a whole population, obviously there are exceptions, but there's pretty much a whole population of people who went along with Hitler's final solution, with his plan. Mm-hmm. There were regular people, normal people like you and me, who were caught up in what Scott Peck in People of the Lie calls group evil. And there are all kinds of examples of that, from the My Lai massacre to the Holocaust to others, where normal people who are just seeking to live their lives, do the right thing, raise their kids, and have careers, do all those things, who, when things like that happen, they get caught up in it and go with the flow. We've seen that in our own country in recent years. To lesser degrees, obviously, but for me, it's a study in the deepest inclinations of who we are as human beings. And the question I have is, and now we get into matters of degree of evil. I mean, of course, there's Hitler at the top, Hitler and others. But then you get down to I get down to myself. I can look at myself. I mean, I don't want to point to anyone. I look at myself, and I'm regularly working against my inclinations to seek my own interests first at the expense of others, even in my marriage, to those kinds of things. That's at the basic heart of what evil represents, at its greatest extremes, to be sure.
Well,
but then it's a matter of degrees.
I want to jump in here because I want to make sure we're keeping this on track in terms of ultimately we're going to hopefully get to a God question at some point. But John, I know you actually were talking to me earlier about how you were doing a couple videos on morality this week. So I want to make sure that this seems to tie in very well with that. So do you have anything that you want to kind of break down? Because I know I have thoughts, but I want to make sure that if this is something you've been digging into this week, you get a crack at it.
Right. Well, so I'm kind of curious because the what you had just said kind of leads me to believe that you're constantly having to remind yourself not to be evil every day. I mean, would that be a fair characterization? Or you said that you work against yourself for doing things in your own best interest, but characterizing as every action as that is in your own best interest as being evil is a bit of a hasty generalization. I mean, sure, if you're going to do something that's in your best interest but harms everybody else, depending on how you define evil, that could be a bad thing. But I really reject the idea that doing something in your own best interest is inherently like a bad or evil thing. I mean, do you find yourself having to remind yourself not to be evil every day?
No, you misunderstand, and I'm sure I wasn't clear. That's the reason. No, doing something in your own best interest is not evil. That's not my point. Doing something in my own best interest at the expense of someone else is what I'm talking about. For instance, a simple argument with my wife, which after almost 38 years, oddly enough, still happens. So a simple argument about whatever, and usually there's small things, but my instinct, and I think, and it's not just because and evil, again, is a horrible word because it has such sinister connotations. But my inclination is to promote my point of view, even if it's ridiculous, promote my point of view over hers, and to not hear her as well as I should. That to me is sort of at the heart of what I'm talking about. And that's an example.
So it sounds to me like you are describing what happens in a brain, and you're taking that and you're labeling it as evil, and then you're saying these things are evil and everybody is inherently evil. I do not agree. Surprise. I personally think that pursuing your perspective and self-interest and getting caught up in the moment like that is a very human thing. It's a result of your brain chemistry and adrenaline and reacting to a perceived threat, physical, emotional, or otherwise. And it does take a lot of work to kind of maintain that and balance everything and remind yourself, oh, I'm not under attack here. This is just an idea or just a conversation, and it might get heated, but at the end of it, we're going to walk away and we're going to be just fine. I have to do that all the time too. But to me, that's not evil. That's just regulating your brain. That's being an adult. So my question, and I guess at this point, we're going to have to move into evil part 3 next week. But maybe to wrap this up, why do you call that evil? Like, what about that process is in any way tied to your theology? Because for me, I think a lot of this ultimately backs up a very secular and a very evolutionary perspective where we evolved to perceive threats. We evolved to be very good at pointing out when something is going to harm us. We overcorrect for that a lot of the time because the brain is instinctual and it categorizes things often incorrectly. And the ability to say, wait, hold on, no, I'm fine, you're fine, we're good, this is just a conversation and I'm going to calm myself down, is just being an adult and regulating your brain. So the missing link for me is how we get from that to something evil that ultimately has a theological component.
The theological component is simple. Obviously, I have to go to the Bible for this, which I know you guys don't put any stock in, but since I do, here's the theological component. Jesus was very clear and said many times that if we're going to follow him, we deny ourselves. Of course, there's a whole lot of explanation behind that. Paul, talking about Jesus in Philippians, talks about how he set aside his rights as God and became a human to come and serve us and be, the sacrifice for us. So he made a sacrifice. He became selfless in that regard. Paul also in Philippians tells us, instructs us to put other people's interests above our own. So theologically, that's where that's standard Christian behavior. Obviously, not practiced very well or very often with any regularity, because of what you actually expressed. Actually, I think makes my point that we have to work hard against our inclination. That our and this is the point, that our natural unrestricted inclination or unguided inclination is to veer off into complete selfishness. I don't have to teach my 2-year-old granddaughter. I don't have to teach her not to share with her 8-month-old sister. I don't have to teach her not to hit her when she's frustrated. And yes, it's true. An infant, a month, 2 months, 6 months, but by the time she was 1, my granddaughter was beginning to show the inclination to be completely selfish. And that's the point. And that's where it fits theologically, is what I just mentioned.
Okay, well, I'm glad that you acknowledge that we're going to need a little bit more than the Bible says in order to convince us. The one thing that comes to mind for me is that your interpretation of good versus evil, aka denying yourself versus becoming a selfish person, or rather giving into that selfishness, sounds to me like Stoicism. Do you know who Zeno of Citium is?
No.
He's a philosopher from the 3rd century BCE. So this is around the same time that Jesus was allegedly born. So before the Gospels were written, or the epistles for that matter. And in Greece, this idea of Stoicism was very quickly becoming one of the biggest philosophies in that area. Marcus Aurelius was historically, his book on Stoicism is actually really beautifully written, and I highly recommend it. This is an idea that predates Christianity and has evolved separate from it, and in fact is a big part of the reason that Christianity has these values at all, because what they ended up doing was trying to fit this Hebrew Jewish mythology and storyline into a larger, more consumable package, kind of like Hollywood, right? Oh, well, how do we get this value into the minds of, the biggest group of people? Well, at that point, Greece was a huge cultural icon. And so what they ended up doing was meshing the two together. And we ended up with a common version of Christianity that included a lot of Grecian and Hellenistic Stoicism. So I think that while this is definitely a real philosophy, a real way of looking at the world, that it's a good thing to deny yourself and a bad thing to be selfish and indulgent, I do want to push back that this is somehow granted from the biblical God, because this was existent prior to, independent of, and actually influenced Christianity directly. So maybe you're a Stoic, and maybe that's where these morals come from, and not from the Christian part necessarily at all. But I encourage you to do a little bit more reading into maybe Zeno, maybe Stoicism, maybe how the Hellenistic interpretations of a lot of these Jewish stories ended up being the key to growing Christianity in a more metropolitan area. And maybe call back for Evil Part 3 next week.
Quickly, I would never. I'm no scholar. I'm no biblical scholar. But I don't think any good biblical scholar would assert that the idea that I'm sort of putting forth here is original with the Bible, or that it's located only in the Bible. No, I realize. Well, obviously, even atheists understand that extreme selfishness is bad, and selflessness is a thing. I guess this is the point I'm making, is that it's ingrained in every heart of every human to be selfish, and that to work against it towards selflessness is a good thing. I guess that's the very simple, basic point I'm getting at.
Right. And I think to an extent I can agree with you there. John, what do you think?
Well, I think that it's kind of a hasty generalization to say everybody is born like with this selfishness inherent to them, because for any number of anecdotal stories that you can have about a baby, wanting to be selfish, you can also have anecdotal stories of babies being selfless. and sharing their toys without being prompted. I mean, there are even other animals in the animal kingdom that do the exact same thing. I mean, I'm sure you can find several videos of dogs being selfless without being like taught or prompted. So I think that it's just a bit of a hasty generalization to say everybody is inherently selfish, and that differences aren't there from birth, that we're all sort of like this exact same model of a baby whenever we're born. I mean, we're all different. I think that maybe accounting for those differences is an important aspect that you got to keep a hold of here.
Okay. And being called a Stoic, I don't mind that. I've been called worse things. So,
well, the goal is not to call you mean things, just accurate things. All right. Thanks for calling in, Scott. I appreciate it. Hopefully you call back again, huh?
Okay. Thanks, Dee. Thanks, John.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Not every day you get to talk about Marcus Aurelius.